Greetings and welcome to Who Belongs? Politics of Identity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Edmund Graham, and I serve as the Associate Director for the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. We begin this panel discussion with a land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Three Fires Confederacy made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Cole, who will provide framing remarks for our webinar series. Liz Cole is the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity and University Diversity and Social Transformation professor of Women's and Gender Studies, Psychology, and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. She also co-chairs the Inclusive History Project here at the University of Michigan. Liz, thanks for offering framing for why we're here today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Edmund. The NCID organized this panel as part of our theme year of belonging. It's a series of events where we'll think critically about this deceptively complex concept. Thank you for joining us here today. We're looking forward to the conversation and for your questions. I say it's deceptively complex because while belonging might seem simple when you first think about it, I'm going to argue that it would bring both promise and problems, and we're hoping these events this year will help us see belonging in a more complex and nuanced light. I want to thank Dr. Al Young and Dr. Edmund Graham for the helpful conversations that we've had about this introduction. So first of all, let's talk about how belonging is promising. Gopalin and Brady, in a paper in 2020, found that at four-year colleges, first-year students' sense of belonging predicted better persistence, engagement, and mental health. And belonging is often part of the ways that organizations that have DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's part of the way they describe inclusion. So, for example, University of Michigan's Office of DEI says, "We work to create a university where every individual has a sense of belonging and the opportunity to contribute to the whole." And this is something that we see more and more at universities across the US. In the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2022, they had 60 jobs posted that had belonging in the title, and that was up from 23 jobs with that title the prior year. But belonging is also problematic, and I want to talk about a few reasons why. So first, and maybe most obviously, not everyone feels they belong. So in that study that Gopalin and Brady did that I just mentioned, they also found that students who were the first in their families to go to college and those from racial ethnic minority groups felt less of a sense of belonging than other students. Although interestingly, the pattern was the opposite at two-year schools. Now, it's not surprising that folks who are from groups that are well represented and empowered in an institution would feel more belonging than those from groups that have historically not been empowered or represented. But if belonging is a resource for students' well-being and resilience, it's a problem if it's unequally distributed. The second problem I see with belonging is that compared to inclusion, belonging can be about feelings rather than about actions or outcomes. So if we talk about belonging instead of inclusion, which some universities are turning to do, are we risking focusing on how the excluded ought to feel rather than on what institutions need to change and what we need to be doing differently? Or maybe worse, do we end up talking more about the feelings of majority group members, as in the New York Times 2023 description of a corporate inclusion and belonging seminar for which they hired a comedian? The third way that belonging can be problematic is that messages about belonging are actually encoded in our institutions, in our practices, and our policies. So some institutions are organized in ways that highlight or prioritize their connections to the groups that they think belong, And one example that was very salient to me is the cultural value that universities like ours place on men's athletics, like football. It's also encoded in whose names are on buildings and on pictures on the walls. And sometimes these aspects of our institutional structure implicitly convey messages about who doesn't belong here through absences, right? Are there lactation rooms? Are there gender neutral restrooms? Once we pay attention to this, the ways that belonging can be encoded in our institutions, we might notice that some groups of people feel like institutions belong to them, while they view others as interlopers. And so that's one argument against legacy preferences and admissions. Or you might see it when applicants applying to institutions that use affirmative action policies argue that another student took their spot. Now, along these same lines, and this is going to become something that we talk a lot about in this panel, there's a politics of belonging, as one of our panelists, Dr. Neera Yuval Davis, has written. And that's the fourth problem we'll be talking about. Belonging can be about setting boundaries, about defining who is us and who is them. The politics of belonging is about how the powerful set these boundaries and sometimes how the less powerful challenge them. And so, in this sense, belonging is really implicated in questions about who are, say, real Americans or real citizens, and should the government primarily be accountable to them? We see questions like this playing out in political movements in the US and across the globe. So it should be clear that belonging is not a simple substitute for inclusion in a university that has a mission of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Instead, it's a complicated topic that invites some critical reflection. And our hope is that this series will help us kind of think against the grain of belonging to help us better serve all the communities that are represented in our organizations. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our panel facilitator, Dr. Bill Lopez.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cole and Dr. Graham, for the introduction and framing remarks. I'll take a second to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Natalie Masuoka. Dr. Masuoka is an associate professor of political science and Asian American studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. We also have with us Dr. Cy Stokes. Dr. Stokes is senior vice president and head of research at Coqual. And we have Professor Neera Yuval Davis. Professor Yuval Davis is Professor Emeritus, Department of Social Sciences, the School of Education and Communities at the University of London. Thank you to the three of you for joining us today, and I'm excited to get started on this conversation. I want to direct my first question to Dr. Stokes. Dr. Stokes, higher education has long been a space for social protest. To name just a few, we remember the responses to the Vietnam War across campuses in the 70s. In 2015, we think about the University of Missouri football team who refused to play football to protest the university's response to racism on campus. And of course, we see now across many campuses, including our own, responses to the genocide in Gaza. In your work, you talked about Latinx student feelings of racialization across the Trump presidency from 2016 to 2020. So it's clear from these examples that students' sense of belonging is both deeply personal and, as Dr. Cole said, shaped by institutional responses to the socio-political climate. So there's a lot going on here. Based on your research, can you help us understand some of the complexities of the sense of belonging?
Absolutely. Well, first, I just want to say thank you for having me join this panel. It is a tremendous honor to be surrounded by all this brilliance today, and I appreciate everybody who's joined today. But first, to give the audience just a little background into the concept of racial realism and where that article really was centered. It is a central tenet of CRT developed by Derek Bell, which really posits that racism is an endemic element of society, and that despite some progress in civil rights over the years, we end up reverting into a pattern of cyclical progress and then cyclical regression, which is what we're seeing today as a clear example of that. So in my article, I argue that from a racial realist perspective, and more specifically a racist nativist realist perspective, the racialized outcomes of the Trump presidency were merely a repetition of the past and a foreshadowing of what may occur in the future and now, which is now our past. The disbelief of what transpired throughout that presidency is what Richard Delgado, another pioneer of CT, would argue is a byproduct of celebratory jurisprudence, and which is pretty much the premature celebration of these peaks of civil rights progress that have occurred throughout US history. And the Obama presidency was also a clear element of that. We coming off the back of that, we are in this post-racial society, everything's possible. And then another presidency follows that where it really exposes what was underlying everything. And so I wanted to write this down here. Delgado writes that this misguided perception of progress disables you from seeing your actual condition and implies that this disempowered group is satisfied and will demand no more. It is the first step to complacency toward making peace with the group that has been keeping you down. And so college campuses and college students specifically have really known this cyclical progress really well. And students are often the vanguard of resistance of these larger sociopolitical issues, as college campuses are really a microcosm to the broader sociopolitical environment. So what you're seeing on campus is either about to happen, a precursor to what's going to happen, or already is happening on a smaller scale. And it really can serve as like an anticipatory heuristic almost, like something that you can identify as if it's happening there, it's going to happen as soon as you walk outside that campus door. And so when we think about what this means for students today, especially for folks who are being punished for standing up for Palestinians and for using their voice and the power that they have to advocate on behalf of a marginalized population, we saw this before so many times, as you mentioned, throughout history, and the result is always the same. It's always we don't feel like we belong here. And instead of trying to identify a sense of belonging and wanting to belong to an institution that may be contributing to this genocide, instead of doing that, we're going to come together, connect, build a network over a common goal of developing and cultivating a sense of resistance instead. And so that is, from a personal perspective, way more beneficial to my life of understanding I would rather not feel like I belong to an institution that I may not agree with, but instead I know I could formulate relationships and networks and really broaden my consciousness by being around folks with a common goal of a sense of resistance. So that's really where I was centered.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. You bring up so many points I want to follow up on later. One is this agency of choosing whether or not you want to belong to an institution, which is something we had not discussed beforehand. So I'll bring that up later. That's great. Dr. Masuoka, let's stay rooted in the higher ed environment for a little while. When you and I and our fellow panelists talked ahead of time, you gave just a brief timeline of some of the events that happened in higher ed that put belonging and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion into the public discussion. What are some of these moments that we should be thinking about?
That's a great question. I also want to take a quick moment to thank everyone for organizing this panel and addressing this very important issue, especially when it comes to higher education. I think, just a little bit of background here is I received my PhD in political science, so in many ways I'm going to have kind of a political science orientation to this, and I invite the other panelists to kind of insert some important events and dates here as we talk about the changes in higher ed. But when I was really first in graduate school and training to be a political scientist, I wanted to go into studying and centering communities of color and thinking about voting in elections. And at that time, in the early 2000s, centering voters of color, students of color, right, was in many ways considered a really in some ways a very specialized field, right, limited to only particular circles. We were really seeing conversations about inclusion and belonging coming out of fields like ethnic studies, right, which originated in the late 70s as a student activist movement, really thinking about how students were really trying to make demands about seeing themselves included, right, in pedagogical and educational efforts. And so when we were thinking about inclusion, but specifically diversity in that context, right, a lot of it was thought of as, student level initiatives, or in many ways, specific specialized areas of study. My own personal experience and take was a very distinctive change after the election of Barack Obama in 2008, when race became much more part of a you could say, larger, kind of more mainstream national conversation, right, about to what extent the United States is beyond race, right? There was a longstanding kind of conversation about being quote unquote post-racial because Americans had elected their first Black president, right? But one of the things that I found happen, right, was in many ways this centering of race in a conversation of various different traditional academic fields like political science, and in many ways, right, becoming much more, you could say, a popular piece of conversation. With this increased conversation about race, with this increased conversation about the importance of diversity, I think higher ed has really changed, I would argue, in its orientation, institutional orientation towards towards diversity, is that while we were originally really thinking about diversity initiatives as in many ways student-centered or grassroots-centered efforts and demands made of institutions, one of the things that I think we've seen as a very clear change of institutional response has been creation of EDI types of offices that are in many ways offices that are part of the university higher administration, right? Which is these offices that are thinking about litigation, right, compliance, and thinking about, in many ways, the university's reputation, right, when it comes to thinking about diversity. And so this is a really very different type of strain, right, when we're thinking about diversity initiatives, because now we're thinking about, right, what is the institutional reputation, what's the institution's role, and how's the institution in many ways try to fight against any kind of litigation or compliance issues, right, related to racial diversity. And so now we see in many ways kind of a real variation when we think about quote unquote EDI efforts in higher ed, right? At the same time, we still see efforts at the student level, right, at the educational level, thinking about inclusion in student services, right, in pedagogies, and in even the curriculum, right? But we're also seeing a lot of in many ways, institutional development in terms of the legal, right, and institutional representation in many ways, kind of like a lot of Title IX and Title VII types of programming, right? And so this in many ways can be confusing, especially if you're a student, because if they're all generally under the bridge of EDI, right? Really, where does the activism start, right? What are we really thinking about when we're thinking about EDI? Are we thinking about the institutions, right, like legal responsibilities, or are we thinking really about, right, really centering the student belonging experience? And so in many ways, I think it's important for us to really start to think in these more nuanced ways in which the term EDI is being used in higher ed, right? Because it really has, and I would argue, has become in many ways kind of used in different strains and with different objectives, depending on which part of the institution is using this concept of EDI.
Okay, thank you. So yes, DEI or EDI being used in different ways by different parts of the institution. And as student groups, by student groups, you said, where do the demands of student activism start? I love that idea. Thank you, Natalie. I'll also point out we've referenced Trump, we've referenced Obama, right? So we're seeing the large role that perhaps our political leaders take in shaping the environments in which this has taken place. Um, Professor Yuval Davis, you're joining us from London, so very gracious of you to join us this late in the evening. Um, let's bring this conversation just a little bit of a global context. Belonging isn't something just personal, though it certainly is, nor just on the higher ed campus, though it's obviously that as well. But someone is making these decisions, right? Someone is making these choices about who belongs and doesn't. You write extensively about the politics of belonging. Tell us what you mean when you discuss the politics of belonging.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, of course, thank you very much for inviting me for this very important discussion and distinguished panel. When you invited me and you told me about this, I thought that it was really just an American problem until a few days ago, I received an email from my university, which exactly introduced the whole notion of belonging as a new buzzword in which the whole kind of policies towards students have to work with. And of course, as Natalie described, there have been a history of different kind of stages of policies in relation to DEI issues. I remember many years ago, we had specific groups of watchdogs to monitor the management in case of problems of breaching issues of racism, sexism, etc. Then, as it has become, as Natalie described, it became mainstreamed, and the management had to monitor what it was accountable for itself. And now we are seeing what hopefully is not just apoliticization and cooptation of these issues on the agenda and reducing DEI issues to issues of psychological well-being, etc. So the importance of differentiating between belonging and the politics of belonging here become absolutely crucial. Because when we talk about belonging, as everybody talked about, it is an affective term of people feeling at home, feeling included, and hopefully also feeling safe. But as feminists, we know that feeling at home very often is not safe, particularly to children and women, nor does the issue of belonging guaranteed equality, whether it is within the family and the home, or within a community, or within a nation. What we see that gender, age, class, ethnicity, ability, and other access of power within the community of belonging often do not only exist, but also legitimized. So, and here comes the role of the politics of belonging. Unlike the affective notion of belonging, different political projects of belonging have two crucial roles in constructing belonging. First of all, they established the rules of the game, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable values, beliefs, and behaviors for people who belong. And things I mentioned, the issue of the protest about the war in Gaza, for example, is a good example of something which is constructed often as illegitimate to a way of belonging. Secondly, political projects of belonging determine the boundaries of the groupings of belonging. In other words, they determine, both formally and informally, who can and or belong and who cannot, or do not, or does not, sorry. Illegitimate children can or belong to a family. Can Black people be British, let alone British prime ministers? Do people have to be born into a community in order to belong to it, or can they join it? And how can they join it? And where does one transform from a migrant or a child of a migrant into an autochthonic native who does belong? In other words, viewing belonging from the perspective of the politics of belonging highlights the fact that although belonging seems to be a very naturalized, inclusionary term. Not only it does not guarantee equality and social justice within the boundaries of belonging, but it also draws attention to the differentiation between those who belong and those who do not, which often construct those who do not belong as dangerous and or inferior, definitely as those who are not entitled to whatever rights and resources those who belong might have.
Mhm. Great, great. Thank you, Professor Yuval Davis. Dr. Masuoka and Dr. Stokes, uh, Nira brought up a point that I think you both began to touch on, right? Is that's this cycle. It sounds like from activist to mainstream or from grassroots to mainstream cycle, and that at different parts in the cycle, different folks, including, as you mentioned, Natalie, lawyers are involved in the shaping of DEI or EDI. I wanted to see if you all had any response to that. What does the role of what does that cycle look like, and perhaps where are we in it in the role from grassroots to mainstream?
Yeah. Dr. Matsuoka, do you want to go first or? Okay. Yeah, I think what we're noticing on a corporate level, I worked primarily, like all my clients are Fortune 500 companies. And so you're seeing it at the largest level on a global scale right now as we speak, in terms of how it manifests within the context of risk mitigation and risk aversion. So those are the two that every single time you have a town hall, anytime you have a discussion with corporate leaders, that's the number one thing. So the legal teams are hard at work right now trying to figure out how do we avoid litigation? How do we avoid a lawsuit? And a lot of it is centered around and actually the Meltzer Center here at NYU, it does some incredible work on this. They developed a website that actually has information on current legal battles that are ongoing right now, but then they categorize it. A lot of it is centered on targeted programs to support marginalized populations specifically. And so when you think about the risk that it comes with that, it's not that there's any federal legislation that's already in place, but there's a chilling effect that occurs already where we're seeing that these cases are still pending, even if some of them settle because whoever brought them wasn't prepared to bring them in terms of a real battle here. But these cases are coming up more and more common as we go throughout those years. So as it becomes even more so with this next presidency or whatever, however the socio-political climate shifts, this risk assessment is going to be a key element of DEI, and which makes DEI this hot touch issue where folks are just afraid to get near it in the first place. So I think in terms of how it's already gone from the grassroots to the highest level, it already occurred. I don't think it's grassroots anymore. It is at the highest level on a global scale, because as we'll get into later on, whatever's happening in the U.S. is going to be reflected on a global scale anyway, especially since a lot of these multinational companies are housed here and headquartered in the U.S. And therefore have an influence in their global markets. So.
So, and you mentioned a chilling effect of this legal action. Chilling effects to whom, right? So whose behaviors are changed, who is chilled, who doesn't do anything or do something because of the potential for lawsuits.
Yeah, I'll say corporate decision makers at the highest level. I think folks are from CEOs to CFOs, COOs, not only just the C-suite, but just senior execs who report to them. Every single thing is if we make this decision, just as you would in finance, I would assume, right? Just if we make this decision, what is the cost benefit analysis of this? And if they don't see a direct monetary value attached to DEI, which is why you always hear about the business case, if you don't see that at least directly, right? Because we know that it's going to help a talent pipeline. We know it's going to help with things further down the line in terms of how successful your organization is. There's so much data on that, but it's not direct, as in if I hire this one person, I'm going to get this much money, right? It's not as direct. So it's hard to translate that. So from the lens of these corporate leaders, they're thinking, if I don't have that direct connection right now as a counter to what's happening in this broader world and to justify taking this risk of engaging in DEI and doubling down on DEI, then I'm not going to do it. But the corporations that are winning right now and will continue to win as we move forward are the ones who are kind of ignoring because they know they have such a strong infrastructure of DEI that's 2 decades long, thinking, well, you can't really get rid of DEI because it's already built into everything that we do. So we're not really scared off right now. It's, you can try to come at us as for some lawsuit, but we've been prepared for this for quite a long time. We have these programs that are successful. Here's why we justify it. We have the data for it now. But it's the new organizations and new companies that are coming out that just started this work 4 years ago that are now starting to run away and thinking, whoa, we got into this way too soon or way too fast. We're not prepared. And now when it comes to the legal battle, we just don't have the resources in place to actually take this on if it does come our way. So that's really what I mean by the chilling effect. And, it doesn't apply to all companies, but definitely a lot of them.
Great. And Natalie, what do you think about this? Sai describes this looking for profit or fear of litigation as shaping DEI. Do you think that rings true in some of higher ed DEI programs as well?
I mean, I was just I appreciate Sai. Thank you for going first because you actually in many ways prime me to think about a kind of an old memory. I remember at a previous institution that I worked at. I was put on an EDI committee, right, and as a scholar of voting rights for communities of color. And really kind of not really knowing, right, like exactly what this university committee was going to be doing. One of the things that was being implemented at the time were these training sessions, right? So these kind of EDI training sessions for faculty to make it, demonstrate that the university wanted to demonstrate its commitment, right, to EDI. And so I go to this this training session. It was about about an hour long. And the entire training session was, what are ways that you can talk to a student that won't get you sued, right? So it was all of these different scenarios. It was a corporate lawyer who came. He gave all these different scenarios for us to practice, right? If you were in this scenario, what's the right way and what's the wrong way, right, to engage in this effort? And so to me, right, this is, especially if we talk about chilling effect, right? So to me, this is as someone who on the academic side, right, this is not necessarily is something that I was really coming into this session, really thinking that this is what was going to be a conversation when we were thinking about diversity on the campus, right? This is actually in many ways, right, this situation here where I was being trained, right, to be in many ways an agent of the university and making sure that the university, right, in many ways, right, was not going to be liable for various different incidents that they would be needed to protect their faculty from. So this is in many ways, I think to kind of speak to the chilling effect, right? If this is in many ways faculty who I was thinking about this, and this is kind of we were talking about this on when we were giving feedback, right? Like if you are a faculty member who isn't necessarily engaging in like I am, right, issues of race and equality in your academic work, right, but this is being presented to you, right, as a faculty member about this is what comply, right, like thinking about diversity on this campus really means, which basically means how do you comply and effectively not get sued, right? That what really then does this mean, right, for other efforts, right, to try to engage the university in rectifying, right, inequalities, right? Because this is not really, that session was not about rectifying inequalities, right? That was a session very much about scaring faculty, right, to think that they're about to be liable, right, for a conversation that they're having with the student that might be perceived as biased.
And you use the phrase an agent of the university, right? Pointing out at some point we're shifting and we are the ones who are determining who belongs in this cycle. Dr. Yuval Davis, do you have anything you want to add? How is this awareness of litigation shaping? Go ahead.
I think it's very important illustration how discourses of belonging are determined politically, because it's not so much just the litigation, but as you said, the threat of litigation. So the censorship is voluntary and self-directed. We censor ourselves in order not to talk in a way which will construct us as outside what is accepted in terms of the political project of belonging, which are determined. And sometimes it can reach and absurdity when discussion of these issues become rhetoric rather formal, rather than a genuine attempt to try and deal with issues of inclusion, exclusion, racism, and so on. I remember a colleague of mine in another university in Britain wrote a report about the way that a university were practicing racist practices. The university was awarded as a distinguished university which is concerned about issues of racism, not because it did anything about this incident, but because this report was part of the documents that the university submitted to the government. So you don't have to do anything, but you have to appear as if you are concerned. And this is kind of an extreme case of chilling effect, I think, as you try to describe it. So this is why, while the notion of belonging seems so benign and psychological well-being is something which we all need and definitely wish for all our students, and they do need it in order to succeed in their studies. What it means to belong is a political project. And this is why we cannot just naturalize it and transfer it from one formal terminology to another. We have to challenge, what does it mean? What are the rules of the game? What are the boundaries of who is belonged when who does not? And this, of course, relates to much wider social issues of the rise of autochtonic nativist form of politics in which there is no contents, or even in terms of belonging to particular ethnicity or race, but I belong and you do not belong, and therefore I have the power and the rights and the entitlements and you do not. And this is unfortunately part of the dangers of where we are now, in the way that Sai described the pendulum at the beginning.
Well, thank you, Nira. You said someone decides the rules and the boundaries of who belongs. So let's talk about that for a second. Who decides the rules and the boundaries of who belongs, and how do they regulate it? Does anyone want to start with that question?
I don't think you can have one answer to that, because it depends on the specific unit of belonging. If it's a family, those who make decisions are very different if it is the nation or if it's the globe. And also it depends on the political project of belonging. If it's more inclusionary or democratic, or it is much more hierarchical and exclusive. So I myself don't have an answer to this question.
Natalie, Sai, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with Nira. I mean, I think, I can maybe offer like a more specific example as kind of working through this idea of belonging, but and not necessarily to kind of jump around on various different topics that I know we're going to hit, but some of my research has been on, for example, the role of immigration policy, right, in thinking about how our federal policies towards immigration in many ways have had a very consequential trickle-down effect then about how Americans then think about the belonging of new immigrant groups. And I think this is in many ways, in my training as a political scientist, really thinking about how federal policy and how we've outlined our entry, who is allowed to enter, right, in terms of immigrant communities through our federal immigration policy, has in many ways informed, who we think is as desirable and undesirable immigrants. Our federal policy is defined, right, specific throughout history, specific ethnic groups that have been formally denied entry, starting with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, right? since 1790 implemented a naturalization restriction to only white persons. In practice, right, we can see once we know this history, how today, when we think about which immigrants we think is deserving to be given quote unquote legal entry in the United States, right, are very firmly denied. Very firmly laid out, right, and have history in these formal federal immigration policies that we have instituted throughout history. And so as we think about, right, this role of formal policy as having this trickle down effect, right, in terms of then being information that we as everyday residents or everyday citizens, right, think through and think about how, right, we weigh who belongs and who doesn't. You know, we can think about that application in really other aspects. And since here I'm really kind of coming from a higher ed aspect for this conversation, right, we can think about then the importance of and the effect of higher institutional policies, right, that formalize admissions, right, and various different policies of inclusion, real inclusion for a diverse set of students, and how that does, in fact, right, have in some ways, in ways that students don't necessarily even realize or are conscious of who is considered, right, belonging to that institution.
That's great, Natalie. Thank you. Sai, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think let's just think broadly here. We think about the University of Michigan. I'm, an alma mater for myself, right? It is happening on campus as we speak. When we think about recordings that have been heard and are now being spread widely, in terms of institutional values, institutional resources, how they're spent, whether or not they'll be received, you already have an indication of, it's essentially the quiet part was said out loud, where we all knew what was happening in terms of, from a structural level, not only a social level, but from the structural level, how one's sense of belonging can be determined. And so when we think of what it means for a university to advocate on the behalf of Palestinian students, for example, if you were going to be threatened with stripping of your government funding of your institution, especially as a public entity, then that is a real threat that one has to grapple with. And whether or not you're going to, secede to that threat or not, or concede to that threat or not, that is, that's a choice that I know at least is being made on all college university campuses nationwide right now. But what it inherently does is pretty much predetermine the impossibility of any Palestinian student feeling a sense of belonging on a college campus. When you know that it's tied, your humanity is tied to these funding sources, and it's debated in these rooms. And so you have no control over your belonging anymore. You have no control over how you can feel a part of a broader institutional fabric and feel as though that you can create a community there and be proud of it, right? Because if you know on the highest level, your humanity and those who represent you on a global scale are being debated in terms of their humanity and whether or not, and if they, your institution disagrees with it, they can literally be, threatened with funding issues. These are what we mean by structural racism at the highest level. When you think about what it means for students, at least, you're seeing students fight against that, formulate a sense of resistance instead, and which is exactly what I was speaking on before, is that it no longer becomes a sense of belonging. I would not want to belong to an institution that has having this debate over my humanity. And we've heard this from scholars throughout history, that why would you want to belong to something that, essentially is to your peril and advocates to your peril. So I think in terms of how we think about power and how we analyze power, we have to name these things because it's not only happening on college campuses. Once again, microcosm to a broader sociopolitical perspective, definitely happening in corporate right now. I was doing a speaking engagement at a large financial institution, a global financial institution the other day, and the CEO came and was a guest speaker and was a huge DEI event. And they almost said it. And they said one side, and they said, yeah, on October 7th, this happened, and this is how we made sure we advocated for our employees in Israel. And I think it was really important that they said that. But then they were about to say the second part. And they said, yeah, and then the subsequent response So anyway, I just want to
Mm,
make sure that and I was like, because someone's looking and someone's watching. And at the highest level, you have to have a risk analysis, a cost benefit analysis. If I say these words right now in front of this crowd, who has a camera, who has video, who's recording me, therefore who can share it to our stakeholders, who's going to get pissed off and then remove all their investments from our firm and go to our competitor. And that is billions of dollars that they're risking by being on that stage and saying what they have to say. Now, there is a sense of bravery that comes with DEI in that same element, right? Will you be brave enough to make that step? Is it important enough to you? Yes or no? Not everybody has to be an activist. I understand that. But we do have to hold the folks accountable who are in power to understand if you are going to be in a position of power, you are one of the few people on this planet Earth that has the power to do something that nobody else can do. So will you step up or not? And so I think that's where we are right now, where you're just not seeing that, at least not yet. And on college
mhm.
university campuses, you see an apology tour for how folks responded to the Vietnam War 50 years ago. And we're going to see the same apology tour 50 years from now for what's going on right now. But the damage has already been done. So how can we prevent further damage from occurring and not have this apology tour be even more significant than it will be? And just get it right the first time, because I think it is obviously a humanitarian issue, but it's a very clear standing from a central power analysis to understand what's going on a global scale. So,
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. You said control over our belonging again, and you're bringing us into the conversation about resistance and bravery and activism. I think we've done a good job of establishing what are some of the challenges with belonging and who controls it. I'm getting questions from the audience that are taking us in the next direction. This is great. Um, to build off your point, Sai, what does resistance look like? And is it time to create our own systems or our own institutions? And Natalie or Nir, I'll start with one of you. What does resistance look like? And is it time to create our own systems or institutions?
Well, would you like to go first, Nira, or?
As I'm not American, obviously resistance is very different. I think what Osai was speaking was very much a kind of risk factors and of a new liberal university, which of course it spread all over globally. Also, this structure, because the risk is very much measured in terms of loss of income, while when the state kind of funded universities on a more a, by criteria which were not so unstable and not very much dictated by profit, it was easier to resist. But so it's very easy for me, a retired professor who is not now already established my career, my life, my work, to tell students who are very precarious and their future is very precarious, how they should resist or not. I don't think that I'm in any kind of position to say that. I myself, in my own personal history, I was one of a few Israeli Jews who became anti-Zionist and have been in some ways. There have been consequences obviously on my life and my both in Israel and when I moved to live outside Israel. But I think the risks for me as an Israeli Jew rather than a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, let alone a Palestinian with no Israeli citizenship, were much smaller. And of course, my life would try to support the resistance of my students from wherever they came on the globe, as well as, of course, Palestine and Israel. But I don't feel that I'm in a position to tell them. I can only say I would welcome and support any resistance that you do to this kind of exclusionary policy.
And I think that's great. There's a comment, many students are not in a position to leave institutions where they don't feel belonging. So this certainly speaks to your point, Nira, that not everyone's in the position to engage in some particular type of resistance. But I'm thinking, we're thinking students, we're thinking faculty, we're thinking staff and at administrators, and there's perhaps different ways we can engage in resistance along those lines. Natalie, what do you think?
I mean, I think, when we're thinking about practices of resistance on college campuses right now. I think, of course, we think about the student activism, especially that, Sai's mentioned. But I think, we also think about resistance in terms, we can also think about its resistance. And I'm not necessarily saying this is going to rank over anything else. But another way to consider resistance, right, is to think about, really pushing, right, for institutional change and really thinking about, for example, what are different pathways, right, to thinking about true belonging and inclusion. I think in some ways, using some of the language of anti-discriminatory, we're finding is not necessarily successfully being truly used towards efforts towards equity in today's litigation world, because I think in many ways it's like, as Sai's talking about, it has been kind of flipped towards risk management here from the more corporate or administrative side. But alternatively, right, would there be other avenues or other language, right, to think about how to voice resistance? And I think this is where a lot of the conversations about academic freedom are really starting to take shape, right? And I think, watching what's happened over college campuses over the last year, there's really been a sharpening in thinking about academic free speech, right? And to what extent then is this a different way of entering the conversation and us being open, right, towards seeing new pathways, right, to think about how activism can be articulated, may be an important way that we want to think about resistance in this moment.
Great. Um, and we see one of our comments from the audience brings up why we might we think about resistance as defining, not defending, from Crenshaw, and might we speak to our choices about strategies of activism and engagement, resistance and engagement. So let's go back to thinking about not only a student activism, but also faculty and administration and us personally. How do we choose those strategies? What are some of the things we think about as we go ahead, as we go forward?
I just want to, I'll speak from my own perspective
Sure.
as a student activist in especially my undergrad years. Um, the success that we had at UCLA, albeit it could have been a lot more if we, knew what we were doing as 19, 20-year-olds. But at the time of the what we really relied on was tenured faculty, to be honest, and administrators that we knew had been there for 20 years, who advocated on our behalf, were in rooms that we weren't in. From a student perspective, there's a lot of things that we know we have the power to control. We have social mobilization at our hands. We know that we live in dorms, that we know we can quickly organize and be, outside of the lens of the broader, surveillance of the college campus, and just get together and organize, different events or protests or demonstrations, whatever it may be. So there's that element of it. But we also know from a risk perspective, students risk less than faculty do in terms of just life stage for the most part. That's a generalization, but for the most part, most folks being 18 to 22 are at a different stage of life than someone who's a junior faculty, has a family and kids possibly, who is thinking, I don't even have tenure yet. How can I engage in this conduct here and really help even collaborate with students, and have my name out there without the risk of me losing my job and therefore losing my livelihood. And this itself is power at its very core. When you challenge power, these are the risks that you take, and understandably so. A lot of faculty who are not tenured, don't have that protection, will not take that risk. And students also have to understand that. we made sure we went out of our way to make sure that whatever junior faculty we were engaging in, their names weren't in anything. They weren't in any pictures. They wouldn't march with us. They weren't anywhere to be seen. But we knew that they wanted to help us behind closed doors. So we invited them into our meetings. We made sure the doors were locked. And we made sure that whatever meetings we were having were ones that they could contribute to the conversation, feel that they were a part of something bigger, but then understand when they left that room, we weren't going to put them on blast. But the tenure faculty, and this is different now, I want to point that out. Tenure faculty, at least at the time, tenure meant a certain level of protection. And it meant that they can challenge administration in certain rooms, so on and so forth, and actually be a part of the discussion. Things have changed now, just as Dr. Masuoka just said, right? When you think about academic freedom, there is just almost no such thing anymore when it comes to what it means to actually have tenure at a university or college university. So I think that's even a broader discussion of how power has now transformed in such a way, and oppression has transformed in such a way to even break the rules of engagement. Because we used to have a certain set of rules, we used to have a certain set of agency over this process, and now it just seems that there is no code anymore. And when we break that code and we break that social contract, it really does beg question, like, how far will they go to the point where all these things that we strive for become meaningless and obsolete just because we are challenging the status quo? And so I think that's kind of where it stands right now on college campuses, where you have to understand that level of how power interacts differently with where you are in the university. But even that itself, I mean, it's way different than when I was in college. And I know that a lot of professors now are just, tenure professors now just don't have that security like they once did. But nonetheless, understanding that power dynamic is key.
Go ahead, Nir.
I absolutely agree with you. And of course, every person has to do their own kind of balance of what they feel they can risk, not just themselves, but their nearest and dearest, and for what they believe. But I think this, what Natalie, the sentence of Kimberly about the defining, not resisting, is of crucial importance here, because what is at stake here is the political project of belonging, which defines who is entitled to participate in making the decisions of what is legitimate to say and what it is not. And they are trying to naturalize it, to predefine it. And by questioning it, by saying, no, this is not natural, this is not right, it against any way in which creative knowledge can be promoted, let alone morality and social justice, then I think what has been happening is that the positivist kind of model of knowledge, which pretended that it's a position from nowhere or for God possession, that it's supposedly objective. This is something which, of course, has been stripped naked. But one of the negative results that it has been stripped naked is that the shame and hypocrisy has gone as well. They don't pretend anymore that there is that they are complying with kind of principles of neutrality and public debate and academic freedom, but there is a particular definition of a very narrow range of what is legitimate and what is not, which continuously shift as a result of very narrow range of decision makers within the institution and within the state agency which control this decision making. So I think in this way, one can use the term belong as a subversive way in terms of, if we belong, then we have a say. If we have the say, we have a say to determine what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. And I think that this is the position of resistance, which is also a position of which stems out entitlement of belonging. But of course, we still don't solve the problem of the boundaries of belonging. But at least within that, we can try and combine inclusion with some kind of principle of distribution of power and knowledge.
Thank you. So we've all referred to how policies shape belonging. So I want to follow up on Liam Bailey's question in the chat. Liam, that's a great question. What would political neutrality look like for issues of belonging?
Political what?
Political neutrality. What would it look like to be
Neutrality.
apolitical? What would happen to our issues of belonging?
There's no such thing as political neutrality. I think that's exactly what Liam was getting at, where, or at least I would assume, I don't want to assume anything, but there's the concept of political neutrality, I think, is something that was even proposed in our last election cycle, which is we are going to push forth the most seemingly neutral person that we can, and put someone forward that isn't as radical as maybe we have hoped, at least not something that would balance the powers that be in terms of, you think it's just a Star Wars reference, like the stronger the dark side gets, the stronger the Jedi Force has to become, right? It's always going to be this battle. We see it in movies. We always agree with it in a spiritual way, and when it's fiction, but when it becomes reality, we oftentimes just forget. And what ended up happening was, well, if we put someone up there to be seemingly at least politically neutral in their rhetoric, at least, what's inevitably going to happen is that a net zero results are going to happen. And so if the past was a net negative in terms of how we interact on a national scale from a racial climate perspective, it's going to stay negative. And there's nothing else pushing it the other way. It just maintains the status quo. And I think when it comes to neutrality itself as a concept, it is, even if you did absolutely nothing, which is not the case over the last 4 years, but even if you did hypothetically do absolutely nothing, it doesn't push forth anything. And so when you think of it from a broader, just a political level, but also just a social level, we have allowed for the emboldening of a particular community, as Professor Ewell Davis just mentioned, right, where there is no shame anymore. And without someone shaming those people who have no shame, applying external political pressure to make sure that some things that you do and say should not be allowed, just from a basic humanistic standpoint, then it will continue on as something less legitimized on a political scale. If you're going to allow politicians to threaten the lives of other politicians, if you're going to allow politicians to spread anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric on a global scale to the entire world and have no repercussions of it, then what's inevitably going to occur is that, once again, it becomes a stamp of approval, of legitimacy, of affirmation to the folks that feel that way. And it emboldens the community to continue doing this work and continue, asserting this damage upon communities that are the most vulnerable. So, neutrality, I guess, from an idealistic perspective, I understand in some ways, but it is impossible in the world that we live in. And I fully believe that the only way to counter what we're seeing, especially from the right, is from a very strong left. And, eventually, hopefully we can get into a middle ground here where we can have normal conversations for once. But we are so far away from that that's why I actually don't hate on the far left anymore, right? Like, I understood sometimes even there was so much that was being said that was, all right, maybe we even need to slow down on this side too. But I understood why, because we needed to balance the force out. And if it's going to be radical on this side, it better be radical on this side. Because if not, we are just going to be leaning more and more close to a middle that's not really middle. And it's really just middle right or whatever it may be. So I think that's kind of where we are right now in this battle right here, where it's whatever is going to happen next month won't change anything necessarily, especially if we remain neutral in these arguments. But I think that's where the grassroots movements are really gaining steam, where they're saying, you know what, we're going to meet force with force, and that's why we're here. So respect to everybody who's engaged in those efforts.
Thank you, Sainir. You're
Yeah.
sharing many emojis. Give us your take on political neutrality.
Yeah, I think that I agree with all what Sai said, but another point which is very important when we look at neutrality, it's a point zero of plus and minus, but it is not the same place. It's moving all the time. What is now, I'm talking about Britain, let alone Israel, and I'm sure, and the same thing is about the United States. What is now the middle? Used to be extreme right 20 years ago. So when we talk about neutrality, are we talking about balancing of the mainstream powers at the moment? Or are we talking a more kind of more abstract ideological, like you talked about the right and left, but also what is the right and what is the left has changed. So I think it is a luring concept, neutrality, but it is a very deceptive one. And we should not be tempted by it.
Natalie?
I mean, yeah, just to add on to in my agreement with both Cy and Nira, I just want to put out the example of our currently some of the growing higher ed conversations about whether or not universities should make political statements in the midst, right, of major events happening across the world, right, and to what extent, especially as we kind of think about in reflection of last year, whether or not and to what extent universities should have been making statements. What's been a really interesting, I guess, development in this idea of political statements, right, is I think a growing conversation of the attempt of institutes of higher education to feel that they should be politically neutral, right? But interestingly, the practice of political neutrality is actually just not saying anything, right? So currently, right, we're in the UC system, we're having this conversation about, what's a sanctioned and non-sanctioned political statement, right? And the only types of statements in many ways that want to be allowed because they feel that it's truly neutral are basically just kind of bland statements about and actually not statements at all, right? But statements about when are classes available, right? So just general kind of logistics or various different functions of the university are considered quote unquote politically neutral discussion points, right, for large university statements. But what's not then being as if this is neutral, but what's actually really not being discussed, right, is exactly I think what we're already talking about, which is in many ways a silencing, right, by not saying anything. Is that truly neutral? Right? And that's not part of we're having a conversation, as if the practice is if you can create a statement that is truly neutral and not actually recognizing that in fact is a political position you are making, right, by not saying anything. And again, going back to my original comments about academic free speech, right, we are really not then trying to have a conversation about how we can have conversations, right? It's actually more about the silencing, right, and the denying, right, of the opportunity to have diverse perspectives being voiced in institutes of higher education.
Great, thank you. You all are bringing to mind a student that I had in my online class, and he worked in a DEI office in Texas. And he would come to class every day and tell me what the latest, political goings on were in my home state, also of Texas, with direct impact on his job, right? So he started to see his job in a DEI office change. He saw the name of the office change, and he thought, can I do the same type of work under a different name, or am I shifting the type of work I'm doing, right? I'm bringing this up also because there's a great question in the chat. Many of us here do work in DEI offices, right? Are working to address equity issues. How do we stay? So, two questions: what can we do? And two, how do we stay energized among this climate that is often attacking things we believe in and the offices that, frankly, fund much of our work?
I think this is something that I've had to contend with, the cognitive dissonance of being in a DEI space that is inherently going to be a byproduct or going to, or at least have outcomes of this cyclical progress, cyclical regression, right? As we've heard. I think understanding that it is a cycle, that it is never ending, shouldn't necessarily incite a sense of nihilism, but rather just understand that the hope exists within this common struggle, this common goal that you have for the rest of your life. And it can be exhausting, of course, if you apply too much time towards addressing the oppression rather than healing and in collective healing, of course. And that's something we've all I think had a more of a focus with, recently. But I think within these DEI spaces, first and foremost, I'm not going to be telling anybody to go quit your jobs, go, go at your boss and challenge them on everything, right? You got to pay the bills. So I understand with the way that capitalism works and the way that we are deeply embedded within it, we all have to be a part of the system in order to just stay alive. And that was what capitalism requires. And so when you think about just being able to pay your basic necessities and just going about your daily life, it does require you to do things that will challenge your cognitive dissonance or at least incite it to where you have to question every single thing that you do, every product that you buy, every action that you take, every place that you go, it will be embedded within it. And so I don't want anybody to think that this is easy work or that you could just go ahead and be, politically radical in every single space that you're in, but to be strategic about it and know the time and place for which to mobilize political action. I think it has to be to the forefront of every discussion. Whereas whether or not it's being publicly discussed or behind closed doors with your network, I mean, this is what we're seeing today, where I am right down the street from Columbia University. I'm in activist spaces. I did not hear once about any of the encampments that were going up until they were already up. And that was a strategy by the students themselves for folks like me who are just part of the broader public now. I'm not in higher ed, but I had no idea until it was happening. And I just commend them for being able to do such a powerful action without having the rest of the world even know. And I think that was really just goes to show what is required in the moments that you choose to mobilize is oftentimes in these rooms that the most of the world are just not in. But they were strategized in how they went about it. They made sure they were prepared as much as they could be, of course. But then it really demonstrated to the world, hey, you know what? Here we are. We're going to face the repercussions of what's to come, and unfortunately they are. But they were willing to take that risk, and of course, at least the whole world understood that what they were saying was true in terms of how the institution responded. So I think it's definitely a difficult question to answer. But I think the main thing is just knowing the time and place and making sure that you can prepare with the strategy.
Thank you, Sai. Natalie, Nira?
I mean, I think one additional point on what Sai's saying, which is I think the reality is that institutions of higher education are not, especially leadership and the most senior ranks of faculty, are not diverse places. I think that's like the number one thing that we have to be mindful of. That our student body, right, is a fundamentally different population than people of power in higher ed. And so I say that because one of the efforts in DEI, right, is hiring, right, is thinking about personnel. The people that we're choosing to populate the university can have real consequence. And I'm not necessarily saying that the only change comes from within, because it doesn't, but some change does come from within, right? And if we don't have people in higher seats of power in the university reflect the diversity of politics, racial and ethnic diversity, gender diversity, right? The things that we, in fact, feel is important for us, right? We need to have those individuals represented in higher ed. And so some of these more basic points here of recognizing, right, some of the basics of personnel, I think is a very low-hanging fruit here when we're thinking about EDI offices.
Thank you. Nira?
Yes, I think from my experience, in some way, the most important thing is, especially for people who work in hostile environments, like the DEI is kind of under attack, is not to individualize it, to work together with others, as not just as a support group, as a mobilizing group, as an energizing group, because it's so easy if you are on your own to just get burned out. It is so overwhelming what is happening. So you need to find the support group that not only support you emotionally, but support your values, give you solidarity, in terms of your struggle, realizing that not everybody had always to work together because specific conditions might differ in different places, but as long as this, what I call in my work, transversal solidarity is beyond borders and boundaries, that you share the values and you give support and respect to each other, and while realizing in different positionings there are different powers and different considerations. I think this is the only way to survive. Otherwise, you just get burnt out.
Great, thank you. All right, I'll ask one more question to wrap us up and then turn it over to Dr. Cole. So my fellow panelists, we have hundreds of educators, 250 now, more at the viewing, and about over 300 at the peak of the session. People who care about their communities, activists, educators in front of us. What is one thought you want to leave them with as they go about their work and as we move into the election in the US? What's something you want to leave our audience with? And I'll give you a second to think about that. Whenever you're ready, Nira, do you wanna go first?
Well, I think that the most important thing, I think, is that we need to respect while transform the issue of belonging, to incorporate an awareness of belonging to a political project of belonging in which diversity, equity, and inclusion as structures, as policies, but definitely as a discourse which determine the nature of belonging in university, should determine not to treat belonging only as a form of well-being.
Thank you. Sai?
I think understanding that it may be difficult, but you can go the rest of your life never gaining a sense of belonging to the institutions for which you were part of. And that's okay. I think what is important to understand is that our identities being enveloped within our institutional affiliation is where that problem arises. If you feel too much allegiance to the institution, then whatever the institution does is therefore a reflection of yourself, and that's just not true. There are so many pockets of resistance that you can formulate within your own communities. And community building is a lost skill set these days, because I know it's extremely hard, but it's also not valued by institutions necessarily. It's something that you oftentimes have to put forth and be uncomfortable sometimes and put yourself in these spaces to where you can cultivate them yourself. Reaching out to folks, understanding that if there are folks of either the same or even different politics, to be in rooms that challenge you. And I think the institute, depending on institution to provide that for you, I think is unrealistic, especially now of this concept of political neutrality being spread. But those politics don't have to exist within the spaces that you create yourself. These little microsystems that you're a part of every single day. So I think for the rest of your life, even if you never achieve that sense of belonging to the organization you're a part of, that's okay. As long as you have the community that you feel you belong to, that will have your back, that you could heal with, and really just continue, one day forward in this fight. So,
Thank you. Natalie?
Just really coming in from my perspective about thinking about higher ed, I think a lot of my comments today have been highly critical. I mean, I think the conversation generally, right, thinking about really the difficult times in higher ed that we are in now. But I think at the same time, I would like the audience to leave the audience here recognizing the really amazing innovations and heart of our students in particular, right? And thinking, especially in this last political cycle here, what really our youngest generation are really pushing us, right, to reconsider boundaries, right, think about setting their own definitions, And I think that that makes us really hopeful, right? While higher ed may be having a particular moment, I think we are hopeful with every new generation, right? About and as Sai is saying, like if we are that precursor here to the greater national conversation, this is what should be giving us hope, right? About thinking about our redefining, right? How we even define what belonging is.
Great. Natalie, and what great words to end on. We're hopeful with every new generation. Members of the audience, please join me in thanking Natalie, Asai, and Nira for their wonderful contributions to this discussion. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Graham and Dr. Colt.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to the panelists. This really was fascinating and complex and really did the work that we hoped it would. So let me just say a few things about what I heard today. I think one of the powerful messages is that we saw the ways that belonging is political, contested, and changing over time, so much more than a feeling. And one problem that we saw with this idea of belonging is that often we kind of naturalize it. We imagine that it's just obvious or innate who belongs and who doesn't. But when we think of belonging that way, it kind of erases the ways that belonging is always contested, and so it's not possible to be neutral. In fact, we talked about even the ways that the idea of neutrality shifts over time. Once we start to think of belonging as something that is done rather than felt, we can think about what does it mean? How does it get decided? Who's deciding it? What are the rules of that game? We talked about the dynamics of how the rules of the game play out across higher education, corporations, global politics. I really appreciated the way this conversation was so wide-ranging. We talked about how the powerful often determine who belongs through policies. We talked about the effects of immigration policy trickling down to people's attitudes about who belongs. And how it's a problem if those making these decisions only represent certain groups. But we also saw how even large organizations like corporations and institutions of higher ed are trying to maneuver within these projects. They use these DEI programs to protect themselves from legal risk. So they're not always about rectifying inequalities. They can't always do what we would hope they do. But individuals have agency here too. We talked about student activists who decide they don't belong because they don't agree with the policies of the university. I think one of the most powerful upshots here is that we have control over our sense of belonging, even as we know that not everyone's in a position to leave or create change. But I want to remind everyone, exit isn't the only choice. Dr. Yuval Davis, I think, said we can use this idea of belonging subversively. If we belong, we have a say. We can determine what's legitimate. And then we closed with this great advice about what we can do for those of us who are working in higher ed and belong it and beyond. And what I really heard is that institutions aren't the only place we can achieve belonging. We can work with others, we can build and cultivate community. And once we think about the ways that belonging is not a feeling, it's something that we do, we can start to strategize about how to create inclusion. And in doing that, we have to exercise care for the youngest generations and look to the ways that they're rethinking boundaries and ask ourselves how we can be supporting them. So I want to thank all our panelists again for sharing all this knowledge and experience with us. And I want to thank you in the audience for these wonderful questions that really shaped and guided our conversation. I want to thank Bill Lopez for his, wisdom and the beautiful way that he segued from concept to concept. And I want to thank all our staff at NCID who just consistently help us offer these webinars in ways that are just seamless with the technology and create a space where we can have these conversations. So thank you. I hope you'll join us next time. Watch for information in your inbox. And I hope you will take a few minutes to complete our evaluation, as Elle's reminding us. And I wish you all a good evening.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.